All right, I just want to do the intro.
Yeah, all right, no problem. Hello, guys. It's Ibis of the Aporia Institute. I'm here with Cudley, and we have a guest with us, Mr. Dom Watkins, a very good writer, we've both read. I'd say an accomplished author, definitely, and very well versed on a lot of topics that are big right now in the culture, in the social spectrum. So, Don, welcome to our Aporia show here.
Awesome to be here. Thanks for having me on, guys.
All right, great. So at first, I didn't realize that it was the impeachment today when we set up this show and decided to have you on. So I guess it's only natural to start there. What are your thoughts on the impeachment situation right now going through everybody's mind?
Well, I mean, it's a little bit difficult for me to talk about because I have not followed it at all because I'm actually not that interested in politics. Mm-hmm. I'm interested in kind of the principles of how you think about politics, and I'm sure we'll talk a lot about that.
Yes.
But I'm much more interested in the whole reason I got interested in ideas was because I'm fundamentally interested in ideas about how to think well and how to live well and how to pursue happiness. But just to say a little bit about this insofar as, I do have a view. So, I mean, I'm first and foremost a believer in freedom, which doesn't just mean do whatever you feel like doing. It means having an institution that defines laws that protect us from force and that enforces those laws. And that means one way to think about it is you're putting force under objective control. And I think the very striking thing about modern politics and Trump distinctively is how non-objective it's become, so that there's so little concern about facts, evidence, having objective processes that is a real threat to a free society. A free society is one that respects objectivity first and foremost. And so that was kind of my fundamental objection to Trump. Now, I think the context in which he's being impeached is like, here's somebody who had, if nothing else, a responsibility to uphold the kind of integrity of our election system, and instead concocted and supported these arbitrary conspiracy theories about a stolen election that there's absolutely no real evidence for, and that inspired and helped lead to these, an insurrection on the government, where if you look at the videos, these people would have killed some of our representatives if they had been able to get hold of them. And it's just, basically sheer luck and the integrity of some of the Capitol Hill policemen that didn't happen. No. And so I think there needs to be a consequence for somebody who did not come out and say, like, no, this cannot happen, this cannot stand. And so I think impeachment's kind of the least that should happen.
Now, a lot of the points you said there, I think to sum it all up, the opposition would say, they don't think you're giving Trump the fair shake, and that you're kind of buying into the media's false narratives. And in fact, Trump is the defender of objective truths and facts. In fact, he's even, I heard, trying to begin his own, rumblings, helping news organization. And one of his big claims to fame among his crowd is how powerfully he's shaken the establishment's foundation and trying to drain the swamp of the fact destroyers. So what do you mean when you say Trump is, or maybe his side, or maybe even deeper, the principles and ideas that his side is working off of are anti-fact, anti-objective fact?
Well, I think the election is the perfect example of that. There were all of these claims that the election was stolen, but there was no actual objective evidence provided. And
wait, they say the evidence was blocked. They say the Democrats in their positions, all the people who have turned against who fell into the establishment's grip, blocked the evidence from even being able to be shown. What do you say to those?
Yeah, I mean, if you actually look, so I mean, every court basically threw everything out. Now, some of it was just for standing. That was very often, but oftentimes the judges were explicit that what was presented was garbage. They, even when they didn't have to, they would dismiss on merits, not just standing. And these were often Republican Federalist Society member judges, some judges appointed by Trump. So you have to have a very, I think, conspiratorial view of, yeah, this is all a fraud perpetrated from every corner of, you know, our leadership. And I think that is, there's been no evidence offered for that thing, and you have to be very skeptical. And then you have to take seriously that, at least this is my take. I don't think that the support for Trump is because he's like the most fastidious person concerned with facts and logic and arguments. It's precisely that he fights back against the bad guys, right? Yeah. So we live in a very tribal time, and we have the blue tribe versus the red tribe. And
would you say
go ahead.
Would you say his followers almost kind of attach that to him, that he's not the great purveyor of trying to make sure the facts get out? It's more the people trying to defend, like you said, the image that he actually puts out, and they kind of attach that on to him. They kind of package that in.
I mean, I think it's just, he is a person has no interest in facts and is willing to, you know, lie about everything down to the size of, you know, his inauguration crowd. And then it's the people who support him don't care about facts largely. Now, obviously, we're talking about large groups of people, and so you can't make collective judgments fully. But if you talk about the core support, and I think that the biggest illustration is this, which is that he'll change. People have changed long-held political policy positions in order to defend him. They'll invoke double standards, and often the argument is not X is good and Trump did it, but it's you can't criticize Trump because this other guy on the other side did it too. And when you're dealing with that, you're not dealing with I have principles that I'm judging things by. It's I have a tribe that I'm showing loyalty to, and ideas and principles are all dispensable means towards supporting my group versus the other group.
Now, when you talk about principles in an objective law system, as we're trying to maintain here, how a lot of people question, especially our audience would question, how do you keep from all these collectives and tribal groups? How do you actually stop them from infecting and corrupting your system that's supposed to be objective? How do you maintain objectivity with so much non-objective people and groups that obviously some would claim not only proliferate currently, but they kind of always grow? It's kind of intrinsically in the nature of government almost to develop into these groups that destroy any means of facts or evidence or proof.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard problem, right? Because tribalism is our default. And by default, we kind of congregate into groups that are at each other's throats, and kind of we are focused on in-group loyalty and a zero-sum battle with out-groups. And then if you think about, well, what are the kind of cases and periods where people have overcome that to some extent? It's precisely by rising to the level of reason. So it's really the Enlightenment was the real break with tribalism. And what the Enlightenment was upholding reason as a primary human value. And part of what that allows you to do is have a universalist view that, guess what? We are all human beings. We all gain knowledge and achieve values by our mind. And so we have a universal interest in reason and the universal ability to deal with other people by reason, regardless of where they came from, regardless of their background, regardless of their sex or skin color or class. There's this kind of universalism that comes from a pro-reason approach. And I think a lot of what's been happening to this country, I think, is a complicated story. But the resurgence of tribalism, and I think it's not with Trump, I think it goes back a lot farther than that, but it's primarily a case where philosophically reason is not all that popular, and where what we've really seen in this country, this is a thing that Ayn Rand really focused on quite a lot in her writings, was there's no positive ideals in the culture. And when you have no positive ideals, things that a moral ideal that people are really crusading for and saying this is good and let's unite behind this, then what happens is that people are motivated by negatives. And if you think about what tribalism is, and in the whole Trump phenomenon is a great illustration. It's not primarily even that they love what the Republicans stand for or they love what the Democrats stand for. And there's a lot of data to back this up. It's that they're terrified of the other side, and it's so motivated by negatives. And whenever you lack a positive, then the focus on fighting off negatives leads people to polarize into tribes.
I think what's happening in the political sphere is quite similar to what Rand touches on in The Return of the New Primitive, where she demonstrates more so of a correlation between statism and racism and just general collectivism. How there's like more racism today, or I wouldn't say today, but you can see it more often on the news when Trump started coming into office, and how there's great division, whether it's like, you know, BLM or the whole entire feminism movement, just like great divides.
Yeah, well, so this is very, I mean, so it just as a historical perspective, I think helps us illuminate what's going on today. So collectivism is this idea that we're fundamentally members of a group. And if you think about when collectivism was an explicit ideal that people would come out and say, hey, I'm for collectivism, down with individualism. This was primarily a early to mid 20th century phenomenon when people were upholding things like communism, right? And these were kind of intellectual movements. But Rand's view was that collectivism was kind of an intellectual form of dressing up tribalism, and that the most primitive form of tribalism, she thought, was racism, because it was groups not based on something that was kind of intellectual, like the proletariat was this universal class that was across countries and it included different sexes and races and everything like that. That what happens is, precisely because collectivism is really an anti-conceptual, a non-rational kind of view, you build groups based on the most obvious brute characteristics like skin color. And so that's why she regarded racism as what she called the most primitive form of collectivism.
What do you say to the conservative, the neoconservative, the paleoconservative, whatever they call themselves, right? What do you say to them who say, no, the real answer is the proper collectivism, the proper religion, the proper focus on family? That's the collective, your family in God or something of that nature. And it's the individualism, that consumer, driven materialism that has really brought us down. And they say, maybe we're not enemies of capitalism. That's not really our problem. Where our real problem is this idea of, being so driven by this work hours and the big business. As you know, they attack big business too. What do you say to people who believe that maybe it's not that collectivism, it's this collectivism that we need, with this certain backing of, more of a religious or strong foundation in a morality of helping others and serving?
So once you hold the view that there's something that trumps the individual's right to live for his or her own sake, to make the most of their life, to pursue their own happiness, once you assert the view that an individual is not an end in him and herself, then of course there's a bickering over which group should own you. And I reject the whole premise. I think that the individual has a right to exist for his or her own sake. I have a right to exist for my own sake. And so the idea that, like, I have to buy my right to live and that you owe your allegiance without any choice, against your will, to some other group, I regard as morally repugnant, and nobody has ever offered a justification for it. They've certainly offered rationalizations for it. but
But
they've never offered a justification.
where's your justification if the individual requires groups to protect his rights?
I was just about to get into that. The individual is never the individual. I mean, he has to depend on others for roads, for food. They have to produce. Like, what if the individual is never really an individual?
Well, you have to think about what are the source of those things. Now, it's certainly true that we gain huge benefits from living amongst other people and living in a society with other people. Knowledge, trade, companionship, like all of these things are enormously beneficial potentially, but what makes them beneficial? Well, what I would argue is that the source of any benefit that can come from other people comes from their mind, from their creativity, from their hard work, from them using their mind to understand the world and create the values that they need to be self-supporting. And in that kind of case, it's individuals interacting on voluntary, mutually beneficial terms with other individuals that's the source of value. And that's very different from what collectivism says. Collectivism says that you're fundamentally dependent on the group, that you're unable to cope with reality, you're unable to know, you're unable to produce, you're unable to support yourself. You're basically a cell in this larger body. And like any other cell, you're dispensable for the sake of the whole. And so what I advocate for is not every person living alone on an island, but it's a society of individualists. It's a society of people who love living together and working together and having sex with one another and all of these wonderful things that can come from being around other people, but each person on a quest for their own happiness and their own joy, and nobody owning other people, nobody being able to demand sacrifices from other people. And that's really what the individualist position upholds, not some fantasy that you're better off in a jungle, with no other human being around.
I wanted to mention something and kind of ask you to expand on it that you wrote about in Free Market Revolution, the argument from need. And you mentioned sacrifice just now, and I thought this would be a good kind of tie-in for you. I don't think people have ever heard it put that way. The argument from need. Can you explain that the principle or concept?
Yeah. So part of what we were concerned with Free Market Revolution was this observation that there's often this trend where government grows. And if you look at the kind of dynamics of how that play out, there's basically only two kinds of justifications for the growth of government power, for increasing government control over the lives of individuals. So one of them is what we call the argument from greed, which is basically left to our own devices, we're going to take advantage of other people. We're going to lie, cheat, and steal in order to win at the price of victimizing other people. And that's really the foundation of the regulatory state, where, okay, we got to control people's selfishness and we got to rein it in. Mm-hmm. And then the other side of that is what you can think of as the core basis of the welfare state and government redistribution. And that's the idea that one person's need is a claim on other people's achievements. It's the idea that you deserve something not because you earned it, not because you created it, but because you lack it. And the fact that somebody did create it gives them means that they surrender the right to it. So there's this, I think we're all mutual friends of Thomas Sowell, or yes. Fans, not friends. I mean, maybe you guys are, I'm not. But he has this quote. It's like, why is it greedy for me to want, I'm going to butcher it, but it's why is it greedy?
I butcher it every time.
For me to want to keep what I earned, and it's not greedy for somebody else to want to take it. And this is a point that Ayn Rand, and I mean, she made that point and really delved into the kind of logic for why that is. But that's the idea behind the welfare state or the entitlement state. And that's the argument from need. The idea is, no, it's precisely because you created it that you don't have a right to it. And it's precisely those who have not created something that entitles them to it. And she thinks that, and I agree with this point, that you can put it this way, it's a bad argument, or rather there's no real argument there.
What is it that why does it seem that it seems anybody should be able to realize that if they need to survive as a human being almost. So why is it that the opposite doesn't connect. Obviously, the opposite of what you just described, that kind of bad state of affairs. How come people don't embrace this more self-interest focused, value focused, goal driven kind of view on the world? What's happening with that?
Well, name one aspect of it. Part of what collectivism, and this goes back to the point you guys were raising about collectivism and dependence. So part of the view is not just that we should serve the group, but that we can't actually achieve anything on our own, right? So if your view is that human beings are basically incapable, they're non-efficacious, they're not in control of their lives, if they do succeed, it's just a matter of luck. If that's your kind of view of humanity, then, well, it makes a lot more sense that, well, then, yeah, you can't just say, hey, everybody go out and make your own way in the world, because that's cruel. Like, there's a bunch of people who, through no fault of their own, are not going to be able to succeed. The ones who can succeed, it's just dumb luck. Why do they have a right to what they earn? So there's a certain view of the individual that's built into the plausibility that it's morally necessary and mandatory and just to sacrifice one person's achievements to another person's lack of achievements. And that's not a crazy view, right? Because it's not that there's no such thing as luck. And certainly there's people born into better and worse circumstances. And so it's, it takes a lot of thought to see that, well, no, it's in a free society, everybody has the ability, with a few marginal exceptions, to make something of their life. And one person's achievement doesn't come at other people's expense. It's actually a benefit to others. Right. And that what people who are born without certain kinds of advantages, what they most need is they most need freedom, and they most need other people to achieve a lot. You're way better being born with disadvantages in a country where people are really rich and successful than you are in one that's dragged down to the lowest common denominator.
What, of course, the objectors would say it is that state of affairs that has driven us to these times where we are alienated, and our labor and our value is being extorted from us, being taken from us, and these big businesses are running our lives. They're, as they say, maybe that what I just described is what would typically be called the leftist view, but as the more conservative, even I've seen some libertarians say, now they're censoring us. Mr. Watkins, they're censoring us on TikTok. They're censoring us on YouTube, Instagram. They're violating our free speech. How do we kind of see our way out of these what seem opposed ideas or opposed sides when they kind of seem to be saying the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple questions buried in there, but let me just name two aspects. So I think you can think of as a policy aspect, and then there's an individual aspect. So I think policy wise, it's whenever you have a situation like that, and there, it's a real point that it's wider than the issue of free speech. But it's when you have a lot of things in the culture holding you back, then yes, there are things we need to do to make it easier for people to succeed. And I think it's primarily an issue of getting rid of the controls that make it hard to succeed. And we can talk about some of those policies, but I mean, just to take one that's very popular right now, the minimum wage. The minimum wage says if you can't find anybody willing to pay you $15 an hour, it's illegal for you to work. And I don't care how many studies you have that said, oh, well, it's only this many percent. No, if there's one person, it's illegal for them to work because they're not that productive yet, then that is a travesty and it should be gotten rid of. But then from an individual level, in a situation like that, I mean, my general view is your focus should be primarily on, look, there's still a ton of freedom in this country, a ton of opportunity. And I think it's very detrimental to focus on kind of the forces that are holding you back, and instead focus on, okay, like those are injustices. I face barriers I shouldn't face, but what am I going to do about it? I could sit and complain, but that's not going to get me anywhere. It's really focusing on what do I need to do to make the best of my own life, given the realities that I find myself in today. And I think thankfully there still is just so much opportunity that even if you start out with a lot of disadvantages against you, both those that you're just inheriting, you know, biologically from your parents and, you know, from your neighborhoods and everything, all the way to the political. I still think that for a person who's really committed to success, I think it's very rare. It's hard to project that there's anything that's not overcomable in today's world.
You speak about freedom and prosperity and opportunity, and actually, I have a quote from Equals Unfair that I, hope for you to expand on. But the quote says, "The American dream is about opportunity, the opportunity to pursue a better life where one's success depends on nothing more and nothing less than one's own ability and effort, and where, as a result, innovators come from nowhere to spearhead limitless human progress." So just like Ibis said, expand on the principle and the concept within that, because I think that can be bridged in with a lot.
You have to think about things, I think, from a high level before drilling into kind of a lower level. So the primary contrast that one should have in mind when you're thinking about kind of the state of America and what's special about it, and also what's problematic about it, is you want to think historically and globally, which is that most countries were status-based countries where, like, literally, if you're born into the wrong group or the wrong class or the wrong race or something, it's legally impossible for you to make a better life for yourself. So if you think of serfdom, right, or slavery when the United States had that, like, it's literally impossible for you to make a life for yourself. And that what freedom does is it says, all right, nobody's going to stop you. And once it's a situation where nobody's going to stop you, that is really the only road that people need forward. But then what happens is people start to make something of themselves. They start to use their mind to create things, and you start getting a whole nation that's building things and creating wealth. Then part of what happens is that more and more opportunity gets generated. So the value of that freedom and the ease with which one can grow and prosper increases. And so, you can think about our ability today, let's just say, to start a business. And I don't mean like starting the next Facebook, but I mean like starting, an Etsy shop where you make 60 grand a year and can live like a really happy life. That is so easy compared to even 100 years ago. Like the ability to live a self-supporting life. So one thing I would highlight about that quote is the word successful. People think about that as like, oh, are you in the top 10%? That's not how I think about success at all. I think about success as being able to support your life doing something that you really enjoy. And that, I think, is open to anybody even today.
What I find ironic about the whole entire situation is what you described could, of course, only operate under capitalism, and the whole entire MAGA supporters and stuff like that are going against the capital and in defense of capitalism as well. And Yaron Brook makes a good point that I watched a video is if you're going to make America great, you have to understand what America is or was, right? Which is a constitution based on, individual rights. And me and Ibis have discussed with multiple conservatives, they'll preach for the Constitution, pro 2A, individual rights, capitalism, or whatever. And of course, when we are applying the principles of capitalism, they tend to break really easily because they contradict themselves.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about that. Is there any specific question that you would throw out regarding that phenomenon?
Well, you can specifically touch on the idea how breaking down the principle of capitalism and how conservatives wouldn't be necessarily considered capitalists.
Yeah, that's a good point to start on.
Yeah, so capitalism is one of those words that is used in many different senses, and most people don't have a clear idea of what they mean. Usually, it's like some form of like you like business and like don't like communism, right? It's very vague.
Yeah, that was actually very accurate. That's insanely accurate. When you actually talk to people, that it seems like that is exactly how they hold it.
Yeah, and so we mean something very specific by it. So it's even wider than economics. That we think of capitalism as a social system, which includes an economic system, it includes political system, includes a legal system. And what it is, it's the system based on individual rights. And that means the the sphere in which people can act independently without permission by their own free judgment. And what it says is that the only purpose of government is to protect individual rights, including property rights, so that all human relationships are voluntary, that we can interact with people on mutually agreeable terms. And if we can't come to mutually agreeable terms, then we're free to go our own way. And that a system that does that consistently, that's what capitalism is. That's what a free society is. And of course, we've never had any fully capitalist systems. We've always had some, and sometimes often severe restrictions on individual freedom, but we've certainly have had approximations. And what is, conservatives will often say nice things about capitalism. But what they typically endorse is basically some form of what we have today, but maybe like rewind the tape 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. So like, lower marginal tax rates a little bit and have like, a little less regulation here, but they're not for capitalism in the sense that I mean, which is to be pro-capitalism is to take a radical view. It's the view that much of what the government does today is wrong, that there should be no controls on business. There should be no redistribution of wealth. The government's only role is to protect freedom. And that's not a conservative position. It's a very radical position.
So it seems the waters get muddied for people in our interactions with people. It gets muddy around, capitalists being somewhere around either you're for some, like you said, some regulatory state, weird lower, or against the regulatory state, but only because you want to lower it. You don't want to actually get rid of it, right? Which makes you what allows them to be attacked as someone who just wants to hurt poor people, because they don't want to get rid of the thing altogether. They don't say that. They just say they want to lower it. And then they attach the abortion position. But then in the capitalist group, they have the libertarian sect. So it's almost as if people land on either you're some woman hater, poor people hater, or you're just a flat out anarchist. And all three they see as like the greatest evil. So, and you said, how do we go about it radically while separating these different groups, particularly maybe even the libertarian group, who I know Miss Rand wasn't too fond of, but took precautions to separate herself from, but is always attached to consistently?
The libertarian thing is quite complicated in that I think there's a lot of people who call themselves libertarians who I would regard myself as on political issues more or less in agreement with. But she thought the idea of a movement that claimed to be for liberty and included people who didn't even think there should be a government was, to put it mildly, deeply problematic. So that if we think about what we need are objective procedures to remove force from human affairs, what anarchy actually, like, we have tons of examples of it in real life where there's not an institution that uses objective procedures to remove force from human affairs, and it's gang warfare. It's the complete opposite of the objective use of force. It's people have to resort to gangs in order to protect themselves. And so that's the sense in which she would not have anything to do with that kind of movement. That if you think it's a subtle difference between people to say, yeah, there should be a government, no, there shouldn't, like that, you've gone wrong somewhere.
But they say the solution to that problem is to provide for there to be a marketplace to provide this extraction of force and this protection of rights.
Right. No, but there's a lot that one could say about anarchy, but the basic flaw is that you're trying to equate a market with production with a market in destruction. So force is destruction. It's not the creation of a good. And the point is, you only use the power of destruction to destroy destroyers. You only use it in retaliation against those who initiate force. And so what competition in force can mean only is roving gangs fighting each other. And I understand that there's these, alleged arguments for why it doesn't play out that way. I think they're not good, and they don't contend with the real life examples of anarchy. But I think the more interesting issue that you raised, and the more plausible one to most people, is this idea of to be for freedom is to hate the people who are not getting handouts, let's say. And it's to love with, blinders on the rich, right? Anybody who has a lot of money and a lot of wealth. And the way I think about it is very different. So my view is, what I love are ambitious, driven, creative individuals, people trying to make the most of their life. And that might be in business. It might be in the arts. It's not an issue of they're ambitious for money necessarily, though there's nothing wrong with money, and it's a great thing. And it gives you a lot of freedom and security in life. And I regard it as so insulting to hold the view of, if you were left free, if you weren't getting a handout, if you weren't dependent on others, you'd be helpless to make something of your life. That is so insulting a view, that to claim that you care about people that because you want to shackle them to handouts from others.
I remember
that is not my view at all.
I remember the way Dr. Williams put it. He said the idea that to learn in school, Black people need to be sitting next to white people is I believe that's how he put it, is so ridiculous. and it kind of illuminates it, but it's easier to see it there than how that kind of plays out throughout the whole system of, this driving force of trying so hard to help others that it destroys almost, it seems like, everything.
Well, I'm very big on helping others, but you have to think about what kind of help is actually helpful and under what conditions. And I think the main things that people need. Hold on, Landon, I told you can't be in here right now. I'll be down in a little bit. Hold on 1 second, guys.
No problem.
Okay, I'll be down in a bit.
Hey, if you want, if that happens, then I can remove you. If you, I mean,
no. He just wants me to charge his iPad.
It's important.
So what were we talking about? The kind of help that people actually need.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, one of the biggest mistakes I think people make is that they think about politics in a very detached, impersonal way. But when I think about politics, I try to think about it in a very personal way. Like, what is the kind of help you need in life? Well, it's usually people who actually know you and care about you, and who are helping you in ways that they're willing and able to help. Like, so much of the help that I needed in my career, and certainly I'm not putting myself in the category of people who started out poor and with all kinds of, barriers. I had it way easier than others, but nevertheless, it was primarily an issue of I needed knowledge and I needed kind of inspiration. And a lot of that knowledge was people reading my writing and going, dude, that sucks. This is a disaster. And helping me learn those skill sets. So I'm all for helping people. And a lot of what I do in my own work today. So I have a couple of big clients that I charge a ton of money to. But a lot of what I do for free. And that is help people become better communicators of ideas and better thinkers about ideas. And I think there's no shortage of help in a free society. But you can't combine help with the idea of sacrifice.
I think
that is what the regulatory welfare state is about. It's about sacrifice, not about helping people. And that's a key distinction.
But isn't sacrifice kind of the most time immemorial standard for what's good? Sacrificing for others is unquestionably one of the most good things you can do, is it not?
Well, why I know you probably don't agree with that, but
no, not at all. I struggle to even say it. I feel that.
So I mean, my question to people who would say that, and you're right, that's a very common view, would be, well, why? And I would say a few things that are relevant there is, well, one, it can just be ambiguity about what we mean by sacrifice.
Yes.
So often the things that people will label as sacrifice, I think of as an investment.
Yes.
right? So like people talk about, oh, so much sacrifice in a relationship, like a romantic relationship. Like, are you kidding? Like, I love my wife. Like, it's not a sacrifice that, oh, I'll watch, the kids when I wasn't supposed to, so that you can go off on, like, to see some play or something that you really liked, or whatever the example is. It's no, that's my investment in a relationship. That's profound kind of pleasure. No, the sacrifices I'm using the term is the idea of you're giving up what for you personally is a higher value to a lower value. So it's the idea of you would rather, buy yourself a new car, but you get virtue points if you set that aside and give it to some stranger who means nothing to you. And in fact, the bigger the sacrifice, the less they mean to you, and the more you want that money personally, the more virtue points you get. And that's why, for example, if you think about somebody like Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos, if you asked, did they help a lot of people? I mean, there's no argument. Like Bill Gates, before he became a philanthropist, even, like, Amazon has helped a gazillion people. Just think about COVID. I mean, they basically did like a universal Berlin airdrop, where we're stuck at home and we could survive and actually live, more or less normal lives, that would have been a disaster without them. But then if you ask, well, do they get moral credit for it? Well, no, because it wasn't a sacrifice, right? They profited. They made tons of money. Like their business did well. So the issue with sacrifice is not, oh, it's for others and it's benefiting others. It's no, you've surrendered something. You've given up something. And that's why somebody like Bill Gates, he gets points for his philanthropy to some extent, but not points for building Microsoft.
I have a kind of question that I don't want to veer off of this, but when you talk about Bill Gates and kind of the COVID situation, I noticed this trend line. What is the aversion, or I don't know if you're well versed in the current vaccine and COVID situation, but what is the aversion to getting a vaccine provided by businessmen who aren't sacrificing? It's almost like people desire a vaccine that's coming from someone who's making a sacrifice, because if there's any shred of profit or self-interest, they think literally the vaccine is tainted. Do you have any thoughts on something like that, or how this develops and come from, or how it ties in?
Well, I think it's certainly a good observation on your part. I think that's an eloquent way to put what's happening. But it's our whole view is that if you're not sacrificing, you're out to take advantage of people, right? And so if you look at businessmen, well, they're certainly not sacrificing, whatever else you can say about them. And so they need to be viewed with suspicion. And so if you have if you have a vaccine handed out by a businessman, by somebody who's famous for being in business, well, the fact is, was he making money from it? He's obviously a selfish guy. And we know that is going to incline him towards some nefarious kind of end. And so we should be suspicious. Now, there's a whole, I think, even separate, that's only one aspect of the anti-vax kind of mentality. I don't think it's only an animus towards self-interest in business. I think there's other things going on there. I think there's strains of environmentalism, which teaches us to be skeptical of any kind of intrusion into nature, and to think that when human beings tamper in nature, bad things will happen. I think that's part of it. I think there's just a general conspiratorial mindset that is always suspicious of anything being done by, what would you call it? The elites be the way that they think about it.
I hear it all. The cabal, the elites, them, the group,
the deep state,
the swamp.
Yeah. And so I think a lot of threads are coming together, and it's sad because hundreds of thousands of people are dying from this thing. And we've had a human created miracle, which is 3 companies have created vaccines in an obscenely small amount of time. Historically, vaccines, if you can get them
too fast. Some people say, do you have any information on that? Because I hear that a lot. Like some people go, it's too fast for vaccines. No vaccines come out this fast, and that's weird.
Well, I mean, it came out because we've had breakthroughs by entrepreneurs and scientists where now we can create them and create them much more intelligently rather than just by pure trial and error. And then now I'm not an expert in this, but I just say my understanding as a citizen who's interested in these things is that we know a lot about vaccines and side effects generally, including what are the time frames where the vast majority of side effects show up. And they show up usually within a 6-month period. And we've had more than 6 months of observation. Now you might say, well, but we don't, well,
from us as well.
What's that?
Didn't some of that time we could have had for observation get blocked from us as well?
Yeah, I don't know about that part, but I was just going to say that you could still go, well, is it perfectly safe? And the point is, there's nothing perfectly safe. What you're making is not a trade-off between perfect safety and a vaccine. You're making a trade-off between an illness that is hurting a lot of people and killing hundreds of thousands of people and a vaccine, right? And now, does that mean that everybody should make the same trade-off? No, of course not. And that's why I don't think it's like you want AOC running around jabbing needles in people's arms with a vaccine. Is you want the freedom of people to be able to get one. And so that's my view, is that intelligent people that human beings should be left free to make those kinds of assessments. And the evidence that I've seen is overwhelmingly clear that for most people in most cases, it's a really good idea to get vaccinated.
You said something pertaining to perfectly safe, and it sounds something similar or a corollary to Ayn Rand, the Garden of Eden premise, right? That things that within the market, they have to be perfectly safe. There can't be no negative consequences. It would be kind of off of the Garden of Eden, in which the market would have to produce these things, and if they're not, then we have to be skeptical of those things.
Yeah, I mean, the one way to think about it, or one kind of objection that people who believe in freedom get, is, oh, you don't care about safety because you don't want the government policing it. Now, first of all, that's not true, because there's things you can do under the umbrella of safety that violate people's rights. Like if you're spewing dangerous emissions that are killing people into the air, there's a threshold at which you're violating their rights, and the government needs to step in. If you're running around waving a gun in public, like that is an objective threat to people, and the government gets involved. But the wider point is that one of the biggest dangers to safety, if you're concerned with safety, security, protection from negatives, there's the risks of doing things, but there's also the risk of not doing things. The biggest safety threat that I worry about is that we're not progressing fast enough. We're not advancing fast enough. We don't have as much technology coming to the market fast enough and spread to as many people as quickly enough. So, I mean, and the COVID vaccine is the kind of quintessential example of this, where it's the issue is, what are there's the risks of action, what are the risks of the vaccine, but you can't ignore the risks of inaction, which are enormous. And that is true across the spectrum. People can talk about the risks of emissions, for instance, of fossil fuels, whether CO2 or other kinds of emissions. But you can't think about those risks absent the huge benefits to safety of living in a high energy, low cost energy world, which are enormous. I mean, the benefits we get to our safety and health from living in high energy societies, which is what fossil fuels have made possible. You are much safer, air emissions or not, living in an industrialized society than basically living on a self-sustaining, self-sufficient farm.
I think it ties into kind of that, as we talked about before, that poverty, scarcity combined view, where everything is so scarce, and we start from this state of scarcity, and all we have to do is figure out how we're going to redistribute the things we have to all these people, because everything is so scarce, forgetting that it's people's minds who have to produce things. And I think you see that in economics a lot, and you've written a lot on economics as well. To kind of shift from the more cultural topic, how do you think people in the actual sciences, how is their thought in terms of today? What is your kind of some of the observations you've made in the realm of science, economics? Have you any insight on that?
Well, it's definitely not. It's an areas where I pay a lot of attention to, and certainly I think that on the whole, there's nothing that kind of sells like success. In other words, we're reaping the benefits of these fields in many ways, and that's a testament to there's a lot good in them, and there's a lot good methodological, that whatever the flaws in methodology or shortcomings in methodology, at least there's an attempt to have a methodology, an attempt to like, are people making good arguments, and do they have really good evidence? And I might disagree with them about, what kind of data they find reliable and what kind of evidence they find reliable. But there's a real concern with that, in a way that, if you take politics, for instance, there's almost no concern for that. But there's also things that are really concerning. In the area that I'm most familiar with, I do a lot of work in the energy and environment space. And one of the things that you see is that a lot of the money that goes into scientific research comes from government. And one of the dangers, and Ayn Rand wrote about this in an article in Philosophy Who Needs It, or it shows up as a chapter in her book, Philosophy Who Needs It, Establishing of an Establishment, is that what often happens is when you have kind of a center of funding by people who are supposed to make judgments about what research is worth funding, and who have there's no reason to think that like they have like a first-handed ability to judge, oh, this is the best course of research and so on, is that what it does is it encourages, how would you put it? Intellectual conformity, right? And so what you see in the energy and environment space is it's not like there's some conspiracy where people who think, are trying to hoodwink us into false views. But it's, if you hold a kind of conventional view that, hey, my research is going to show that climate change is a bigger disaster than people thought, you're very likely to get funding. If your view is, and your research is along the lines of, yeah, I think the threat is overstated, I think there's warming, but it's not catastrophic, you're not going to get funding. And that kind of dynamic is very corrupting, even of people who want to do an honest job. And so I think that is one of the things we want to think about, is how to kind of de-link science from politics. And it's not an easy thing to do, but I think it's an important thing to do.
Here's one of the questions from the comment section.
What are your guys' view on transhumanism? I'm not too familiar, but does that come up in the environmental?
Yes. It says a philosophical movement that advocates for the transformation of human condition by developing and making widely available sophisticated technologies able to greatly modify or enhance human intellect and physiology.
Oh, that's a mouthful, but
yeah.
Mr. Watkins, have you heard of this view of transhumanism, or maybe something philosophically similar to it?
I mean, I've seen it pop up in the rationalist community, which, if you're familiar with them, they're interesting people, but I don't know enough about it to really comment on that. I will say this: I think there's a big tendency in people to fear new technologies, and they hear a description like that and they think of like some science fiction movie, and oh, we're all going to be like kind of like mentally controlled and like dehumanized. But in general, like augmenting our power is exactly what we've done through the creation of external machines and through, all kinds of ways. And so in general, on those things, I'm more of an optimist, and I'd like to see it tried. I want it to be done intelligently. I think that the better our ethical thinking is, the better we'll be able to use and deploy those kinds of technologies? Because it's certainly true that you can have a new technology poorly deployed. I mean, I would take social media as a great example.
I was about to say it. Very good.
I'm a big fan, and I think it's a huge achievement that we have things like Twitter and Twitch and Facebook and all of these. Yet I think people misuse them in their own lives a lot. And I certainly have. Like, I've been like in kind of an addictive phase where I should be doing something else. And it's like, no, I got to keep scrolling. Right. Oh, how many likes did I get? I've been there. But that's a problem that we face just inherently in life, is how do we use values in ways that are actually valuable and not use them in ways that are self-destructive or that undermine us. And I don't think we've done a good job of that. But I think in general, these things have incredibly positive potential.
Do you think a primary, I don't know if, I guess you just said this, but maybe you could deeper into something more philosophical. Do you think a primary to all of this is fixing the science of ethics, and first maybe viewing it as a science is part of that as well?
Yeah. I mean, if you think about ethics historically might be unfair, because the Greeks, I think, were on the right track. They viewed ethics as a practical science for living a good life. But what happened with Plato and then Christianity was that ethics became associated with another world. So ethics is not about how to achieve something positive in this world. It's really about how to prepare yourself for the next world. And what you got after that was a moral practical dichotomy. That if you wanted ideals and principles to govern your life, that wasn't going to be useful in terms of succeeding in this world. And if you wanted to succeed in this world, well, you don't need principles. You don't need ideals. You just kind of do whatever you feel like doing, range of the moment, trial and error, without any, it's not an intellectual project to succeed. And I think what we see today is sort of the kind of trash heap of that approach, where ethics now is not even about how to like prepare yourself through, to make yourself noble, by the eyes of God or anything like that. It's about how you solve a trolley problem where there's like, all right, there's two people on a train track and one of them's a prostitute. Like, it's that kind of
funny little tangent. The most recent time I've seen this example get like completely exacerbated was on a TV show where the whole show is about Immanuel Kant's philosophy, called The Good Place. And
awesome show, by the way.
Yeah, it is an awesome show, but I thought it was kind of a funny little parallel.
But from my view, ethics is so not about that kind of thing. Yeah. It's about being on a quest for happiness, and part of a quest for happiness is, what are the principles I need in order to flourish? And flourish means physically, mentally, and spiritually. It's how do I achieve success, self-esteem, happiness? And we need that in order to govern through the world, because it's not obvious. Like, if you try to live by the seat of your pants, it's not obvious what's good for you and what's like. We all know people who have made a mess of their life, and we've had through our own experience a sense of, it's really hard to figure out what a good thing for my life is. And that's what ethics is supposed to do. It's supposed to give you the big picture view of what a good life looks like. And without that, which we don't have, then people have no choice but to live by the seat of their pants. Go ahead.
You say spiritually, and as you know, most people, as soon as you say that, they kind of link that to Christianity. So how do we, and to kind of tie this in with a couple of things you just mentioned, I've noticed one of the biggest trends on social media, even in this political debate type of thing, is this, it's a debate. One of the biggest things on YouTube, for example, is debating God. And then as another addendum to that is debating ethics on top of that, because it always goes after all the God arguments get out the way. They go, well, one of the final ones is, how could there be morality without a God?
Yeah, my view is the complete opposite, which is, how can there be a morality with God?
And
okay,
can you expand on that for more? Because we say that. Can you expand on that kind of conception of it? Because people that blows their mind to a whole nother level.
Yeah, well, so the idea is supposed to be that how are you going to have absolute right and wrong without some spiritual, like, or mystical authority dictating it? And the issue is, well, you can't have it with a mystical authority dictating it. So if you take, for instance, what makes something good? Is it because it's actually good or just because God said so? And the story of Abraham really gets us to at least what most or many religious thinkers have said, which is, God dictates Abraham, kill your son. Well, is that bad? Well, no, God told him to. So the good is obedience to God. And Abraham now he doesn't carry out the execution, but the fact that he's willing to shows, oh, you're willing to obey. And obedience to God is the good. Whatever his whims are, whatever he says, for whatever reasons that you can't understand, that's the good. Whereas what my view is that it's the objective requirements of human flourishing, which are based on our nature as human beings. That's the foundation of the good. And that gives you absolute moral principles. Well, yeah. So the way I use the word spiritual is pertaining to consciousness. And it's what it is. It's looking at our kind of mental, emotional states at a deep level. So it's the things you care about deeply and that are deeply personal to you, the people you love, the ideas you choose, the career that you're passionate about. That is your spiritual fuel, right? It's the art that rocks you to the core. That is getting at what your soul is, what makes you a unique individual, what you'll live and die for. And that is something that's completely non-mystical. And certainly Ayn Rand has a lot to say about it, but I think the needs to have those values that you live or die for is crucial to being able to have the best life possible. But there's nothing mystical about it. It's that these are requirements of human flourishing. And that, I think, is ultimately the root of being able to have an objective code of ethics.
But Mr. Watkins, and you use the word objective. They say objective, Mr. Watkins. There is no certainty. There is no absolute. So how could we know without these duties given to us? How can we know these things that are right?
Or everybody's ethics is different. It's no such thing as an objective universal.
How can we know if there's no facts for us to read to come to these principles? What do you answer these people, Mr. Watkins?
It's so funny that people view disagreement as kind of proof that there's no such thing as objectivity or certainty, because they don't hold it in, for instance, like in scientific issues, right? Like nobody is convinced by the view of how can you say that you're certain that E equals MC squared when people disagree with it and everything. It's like, well, yeah, no, like follow the evidence. Like this is, we can show you what leads to the conclusion that E equals MC squared, or, Newton's laws of gravity. The reason that that's plausible in the realm of ethics and more broadly in the realm of values is that because there has not been, I think, a rigorous kind of proving of ethics. I actually think in the end, Ayn Rand provides that kind of objective basis for it. But even setting aside that, how could you put it? One of the things I found is that most people, at least the ones that I've met, and I met quite a few, most people, they want the best for human beings. And now there's disagreements about how to define it and everything. But once you have agreement in the goal that we want people to flourish, we want human beings to flourish, then it's a purely scientific question that one can investigate through reason and reach real agreement on about, well, what are the requirements of that? And sometimes there's disagreement, but we can always go to the evidence. Does this really result in flourishing? Does this make people's lives better or worse? Now, I think, as I said before, I do want to underline, I think in the end, you can prove that the only moral goal that can be upheld is human flourishing. But I'm saying, even setting that aside, there's a lot that people can talk about in a very fact-based, pro-reason way. And now there's deeper debates about can reason lead to certainty and so on. And I mean, we can certainly talk about that. And I think in the end, that if you think about certainty the right way, that certainty is not omniscience. It's meeting a standard of proof. It's defining a standard of proof and meeting it. That yes, we can achieve certainty, and we often do.
Well, I personally study ethics, so this conversation is kind of speaking my language. But yeah, the whole entire point is that they treat ethics as like some a subjective thing because of disagreement, but they don't treat it as in science. And I tend to use that argument against flat earthers don't believe the law of gravity is a real thing, right? Wouldn't that mean that the law of gravity is also subjective? That's one of my common things. But to touch back onto what you just said, the whole entire thing about certainty, Cartesian doubt. I think a lot of people explicitly or implicitly hold this idea of Cartesian doubt, that there's no such thing as certainty as well. How do you know you're wrong? One of those things.
Yeah.
How do you know you're right? Or how do you know
how do you know the sun will be there tomorrow? Just because you saw the sun today, how do you know it'll be there tomorrow? How are you certain?
Yeah, so this is a fun topic. I'll say a couple things about it. I think it's definitely true that most people's intuitive view is something like, well, to really know something, you just have to be able to answer. You have to start by just doubting everything and kind of build your way to knowledge, right? Like that makes the most sense. I think about it very differently, that even to get it to a project like, hey, I want to really make sure my foundations of knowledge are secure. I want to re-examine everything and really make sure that it's grounded in reason. You just can't start with like doubting everything, because even to get to the point of asking those questions, clearly you have a lot of knowledge. So I think this is one of the really interesting things about Ayn Rand. She says, by the time we get to philosophy, by philosophizing, we have a ton of knowledge. Like we got to the moon, like we created a COVID vaccine, which whatever conspiratorialists say there, is really effective. And so the question is not, can we know anything? But there is a question. The question is how? How do we distinguish between what we actually know and what we don't? And so that really needs to be the project. The project is not maybe I'm a brain in the vat. No, it's like clearly there's some things that are obviously true. And then the question is, well, how do we distinguish truth from falsehood? Because no, it can't be that everything we think is wrong. But certainly we know that some of the things we think can be wrong. So we have to be able to learn how to distinguish them. And that's really the project of epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge. It's a branch of philosophy. It's to define the standards by which we can distinguish reliable from unreliable knowledge. And I mean, I've talked a lot about this on my YouTube channel.
By the way, your certainty commentary on OPAR section was great. And I have a question that might bring us into this where you can expand, but continue.
But I would say for people not familiar with philosophy, I'll just name my conclusion, or at least the broad strokes of my conclusion, and feel free to follow up. But basically, it's that the way that you validate things is through our senses, which give us direct awareness of the world that I think is infallible, which is a potentially controversial view, but I think in the end is true, or logical inference from what we perceive. And that all of our epistemological tools are really about taking very abstract ideas and trying to ground them in what we can directly perceive. And if you think about just the sciences, like the experimental method, even though they wouldn't put it that way, right? That's really what it amounts to. They have to take your sense experience as the starting point, and then it's, okay, we're going to figure out if this idea is true, this is what we should observe with our senses under certain conditions that we're kind of manipulating. I think, and that's just a version of what I'm saying of sense experience or logical inference from.
How do we know we can trust our senses and reasoning ability?
I don't want to butcher it, but I think Dr. Peikoff put like science is just the unraveling of sensory data.
Yeah, which I think is right.
It's and how do we know we can trust our senses and reasoning abilities? Dr. Watkins, can you give him the essentialized answer to that question?
Yeah, as long as we know that Dr. Watkins comes in quotes, because I got an undergraduate in business and barely that. But
that speaks to your writing ability, by the way, because I wasn't sure, but you're incredible, by the way. So,
well, what it speaks to, by the way, I think this will be interesting to you, because I get a lot of questions where like young people have been told basically like you got to go to an Ivy League, and if you don't, your life is over. And basically, I went to a night school, but what I was super passionate about ideas and willing to work really hard to create value with those ideas in the market, right? So it was, all right, I have very unusual, controversial ideas. What do I need to do so that there's a significant number of people who are willing to pay me to talk about those ideas? And so my view is that like credentials matter when more or less the government says they matter. So like, yeah, if you want to practice medicine, like don't follow my footsteps, like go to school or whatever. And if you want to work, at an investment bank, probably you should go to, the best school you can get into. But in general, like this idea that opportunity comes from following these tracks that are set up for us, I think is garbage. And you want to be much more focused on how can I create value for people.
YouTube exploded, besides all the other, progress we've made. I think YouTube in the modern era blows that view out of the water. I mean, there's people making livings doing YouTube videos, from showing you makeup hauls to I watch people that just do tours from their YouTube channel of like, random places in America, just all types of random stuff. I know people who just review interview tapes of, criminal cases. There's so many things. So I think that view is ridiculous.
Well, it's because most people is just this very abstract, like you get paid by working a job. And how does a job have money to pay you? And like nobody really investigates that. But if you view it as an issue of that you're creating value to trade with others, and that's how you get what you want, right? Then like the world opens up to you, because it's all I have to do is figure out what other people value, what I want to create, and then create it. And YouTube is a great example, because if you think like I'm on a Mr. Beast kick, if you know, like, and basically he just sits around thinking, how can I delight people by showing them something crazy and fun they've never seen before, and then creates videos, gives people 20 minutes or whatever of enjoyment. It doesn't cost us anything, but we watch it and he gets paid for it. Like that's value creation in a way that you couldn't, like if all you're thinking about is what I'm supposed to get a job, what kind of jobs exist, like you'd never catch on that. But that's value creation. And now, maybe that's a trivial sort of example, but it's really not. Like it is really nice that we live in a world where, hey, I have 15 minutes and I can just like, be amused in those 15 minutes. And that, I think that's amazing. As to senses, we mentioned that some videos on my YouTube page, I think probably an hour's worth just on the senses. But the basic point with how do we validate our means of knowledge, it goes back to what I said before. We know that our means of knowledge is valid. And so, like, there's no doubting that. But what you need to be able to do is understand its relationship to reality. And so what reason enables you to do is investigate how reason works and figure out, well, how does it actually enable us to gain knowledge of reality? But you can't doubt your means of knowledge, because what are you going to use to prove that it's valid? Your non-means of knowledge? No, using your means of knowledge, you can grasp, it works through your senses, work through cause and effect, that the world impinges on your sensory apparatus, and that results in a direct form of awareness, and you can get why that can't go wrong, and you can get then how reason works by building on sense experience. So it's not that you just take it on faith, but that there's no getting outside of your means of knowledge.
Can I pause you here for a second?
Sure.
For our more philosophically literate audience who may have probably asked this question, can you explain the essential difference between that and an empiricist view? Because once you say sense, you know, some of them, they go crazy. Oh, well, you're an empiricist. Ayn Rand is basically an empiricist. So,
well, so just briefly, there's two aspects of which there's a distinction. So one is that empiricists typically, historically, like Hume, have taken sensations as the starting point of knowledge, that we're aware of, like, oh, there's a, brush of blue, and then there's a kind of like this kind of disembodied odor, and then it's kind of a higher level step of abstraction to like go, oh, that's me perceiving, Joe in blue jeans, right? Entities, perceiving entities is kind of a inference. And they go, oh, how can you make that inference? And Rand, her view is that no, the starting point is you perceive entities, you perceive a world of objects, and it's actually an act of abstraction to be able to break them down into different sensory qualities. But then the second thing is that the empiricists traditionally are skeptical of abstraction. So it's that you can see this world that they might think of as made up of sensations, but being able to conceptualize it, maybe they'll like allow for like, tiger, human, so like very low level stuff like that.
Higher concepts like consciousness,
or freedom, or just like that, all of that's out. And so she's an empiricist in the sense that she thinks all knowledge is rooted in sense experience, but not in the technical sense of viewing it as rooted in sensation and unable to move up the conceptual chain.
Since we're on the topic of like the distinction between abstractions, conceptualization, and sense experience, I've read a little bit, but I haven't fully integrated it. But in Ito, Peikoff's chapter, the analytic synthetic, the a priori, a posteriori. Your take on that? Because I haven't fully read it.
Okay,
as centralized as you can give it. I know it's a giant topic he just gave you to give a take on.
No, I love it. Like literally, nobody's ever asked me that question.
A lot of those questions.
I mean, it's super. It's a very technical piece, but it's a really fascinating piece. So a longstanding view in philosophy is that there's different kinds of truths, and the kind of one of the ways that the distinction will be put is that there's truths that are, so this is the a priori, a posteriori distinction that is, I think, the one that'll be probably most familiar to people. It's that there's truths that we know through sense experience, and that's like, ice floats in water. So there's not like you look around, you say, okay, I guess ice floats, and then that there's things that we know before sense experience, allegedly, and that's like 2 + 2 = 4. So that's an a priori truth. You don't need to like look at 2 blocks and then bring in 2 more and go, oh, thank God it turned out to be 4. Whew, that was a close one, right? We can just know that through pure reason. And so there's very similar kind of distinctions that are made throughout philosophy. But the key idea is that, well, the things that we know through sense experience, they're all contingent. They don't tell us anything. We can't know them with certainty. The things that are a priori that we know without sense experience, yes, they can be certain, but we don't know that they say anything about reality, right? They're just basically us assembling analytically in our mind different ideas. We're putting ideas together. So for instance, if I said, all bachelors are unmarried men, you say, that's great, Don, I'll go with that, but it doesn't tell me anything. You've basically just given me interchangeable words, right? There's no knowledge built in there. And what objectivism argues is that this is a wrong distinction. There's no different kinds of truths, that all truths are rooted in sense experience, and that they tell us something about the world, that they're not contingent. Now, there is what you could call certain kind of contingent facts, although you don't want to use that term. And those objectivism put as man-made facts, things that human beings choose through their free will. But if you take something like ice floats in water, that is inherent in the identity of ice and water. And the fact that you can form a mental picture of ice dropping to the bottom of the cup, that doesn't mean that, oh, somehow that's possible and it's just an accident that it floats. No, if something is not the product of choice, it's inherent in the identities of that which exists. And so when you view things that way, and Peikoff argues this at length, so I won't try to recap it here, that if you view things that way, then there is no kind of distinction to be made. It's that there's only facts to be grasped by reason, and that's a I would say it's a distinctive objectivist view. Although my understanding, though I'm not a professional philosopher, is that most professional philosophers, for not because of objectivism, but from other people who've argued against that distinction, they reject the analytic synthetic distinction. And it'd be interesting to explore what their reasoning is. I'm just not certain of it.
I think I've heard of some who reject. Would you say maybe some probably reject it explicitly and then could possibly fall into it implicitly? Because I know one of the things I read, I think both Rand and Peikoff made the point, a lot of issues in philosophy come down to that switching of the man-made and the metaphysical, that kind of, or inverting cause and effect and stuff like that. So maybe it plays into kind of how philosophies end up down the road in consequences and stuff like that.
Well, I'll just give you one sort of example. It's not exactly on that distinction, but it goes to the point you made about confusing the metaphysical and the man-made. So before we went live, I think one of you asked me about Thomas Sowell's book, Cosmic Justice. And so, and his basic idea is that, and there's a lot I love about the book, though I disagree with some of it, though it's been a long time since I've read it. So please don't ask me too many details about it. But one of the points he makes is that the kind of what we often would think of as the left-wing way of looking at the world is the idea that, the universe is unjust and we're going to try to remedy those injustices. And so from the objectivist view, the universe does not make choices. It just is the way it is. And so it can't be fair or unfair. It's the standard of fairness. Like our job is to conform to reality as it is. And the attempt to basically rewrite the facts of reality and say, no, we shouldn't be born poor with different intelligence levels or have parents who have different kinds of incomes. The government has to fix all this and turn us into kind of a Rawlsian clay where we're all exactly the same kind of lumps in order to have this universal fairness. The way that Rand would put it is that this is it's rewriting reality, and that the only way you can actually rewrite reality in the name of, as Thomas Sowell would put it, cosmic justice, is to commit actual injustices against real human beings.
Yes. Very wow. That's an amazing tie-in between Rand and Sowell. Thank you. It seems like we got to that example in a very abstract way, but what I find interesting is very recently and commonly on TikTok and kind of our debate, and people cherish this position of saying that nature by itself is coercive. Therefore, and this argument, by the way, to give context, this arises as an argument for that, despite the fact that maybe a capitalist or a business owner may be hiring you voluntarily, you're still under some type of duress. You're still under some type of coercion. And that is why force must be used against business owners. So I think it's interesting how, and maybe you could say something about this, how maybe these abstract ideas really do show themselves, especially the more these ideas are pressed on with the right arguments. Because I noticed that doesn't come out until you hold a selfish view and you stand firm on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, I think it's right that there's a kind of view that says, man, if I had created reality, I wouldn't make it so that some people were born poor and had crummy choices. Like, that's outrageous. And the way that I think about it is that, no, it's a fact that people are born with different skill levels, that they're, coming from different backgrounds, different incomes. But if you think about what's going on when somebody offers a job at, say, less pay than you want it, and you accept the job, what have they done? They've helped solve a problem for you. If they had never existed, you would be worse off, right? Like if they didn't create that job that you think, oh, that's crummy, you'd have to take a worse job that's more crummy. That what people have the power to do in a free society is offer you a positive. They can say, here's a job that I'm willing to pay X for under these terms, take it or leave it. And you might say, oh, well, I'm forced to do it because I have bad alternatives. But the issue is that if you turn it down, you are no worse off than if that person had never existed. Mm-hmm. Right? They have not imposed anything on you. They've given you the best option of some crummy options. Now, I want to live in a world where people have better options. And there's two ways that happens. One is you generate better options for yourself. And I think that's the primary thing we should all be engaged in, which is, guess what? I had really crummy options when I was 16 and went around to get my first job. I was lucky that a movie theater trusted me enough to accept $5 bills and hand out movie tickets. Like that was, good for me that I was able to get that.
Not a similar first job too.
Whereas now, and I don't say this to brag, but just to illustrate the point, like somebody paid me $500 to write a text message for them. Right. And it's not because like, oh, they really like Don. It's they had a goal that I could help them achieve. They had a desire that I could help bring into existence. And so you want to generate more opportunities for yourself. The other way that one can be that we can think about like making so that people have less crummy choices is we can attempt to have as much progress culture wide as possible. And so my view, and I understand that many people don't agree with this, but this is why. This is the way I think about it, which is that a free society where government protects human freedom generates the most opportunity for the most people. And I think that's a fine debate to have, or if they think, no, you got to have handouts or whatever. But at least that what I want to stress here is just this point that that one doesn't have to be unconcerned with the crummy options that people face in order to say that it's still good that they have this job that they wouldn't otherwise have, and that the best solution is freedom, not suffocating the people who give them what opportunities they do have, because that doesn't create new opportunities. It creates fewer. If you say, I mean, this is the whole thing with the minimum wage. Yeah, you can dictate a higher minimum wage, but it's a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's true. The minimum wage is actually zero. Yeah. It's no job. And yes, I'm aware of the so-called studies, and we could talk about some of their problems, claiming that, it doesn't reduce unemployment. It doesn't reduce employment that much. But as I indicated, I view this as a moral issue. And in a moral issue, it's not an issue of numbers. If one single person can't work because the government's made it illegal, that is off the table for me.
And your article or essay in here was very good on charity being a right, by the way. And
yeah, I'm addressing the idea that charity is a right. So just to clarify for people, I'm not arguing that charity is a right.
So can you kind of bridge in how people, or like you said, give us a few more examples how they kind of argue this minimum wage point, because that actually is a big topic around our audience as well.
Since Joe Biden is considering it,
especially since Joe Biden it's seen a whole. It's almost like the topic itself has seen, a whole. It's gone viral again. The minimum wage topic. So, what are some of the common things you're hearing, and what are your objections to them?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have too much more than the objections. I mean, look, there has never been, nobody disputes the basic economic reasoning that if you artificially raise a price, that some people will be priced out, right? So if you artificially raise the cost of employing people, you'll get less employment. The argument has been that under certain circumstances, if we look at the empirical data, what we see is that no, actually employment doesn't suffer to any significant degree. And that's why I say, now those have been disputed. And if you look at the actual literature, I think there's very strong evidence that you can see in the data. No, it actually increases unemployment. But that's why I'm arguing it's not an issue of comparing how many more people get a raise versus how many people lose a job. Those are not equivalent issues. That's not what you balance. My point is that if you have a moral perspective, then what everyone has a right to, what nobody has a right to take away, is your ability to take whatever opportunities are around, even if they're crappy ones, and turn them into better ones. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I say, even if one person is locked out of moving up the ladder of success by the minimum wage, that cost is too great, because the main way that people escape poverty is by building knowledge of how to create value in a market, and by building a track record of creating value, and then by building a network of people. I recently, unfortunately, lost my father-in-law, and he had been a manager at McDonald's back in the day, and there was a kid there. I mean, he's older than I am now, but who he was a rural kid, didn't have that much money. And like, this was somebody, my in-laws, when they had been managers there, yeah, he was working at McDonald's, the classic nothing job. But guess what? That's where he learned how to work. That's where he built a skill set and went on to make something of his life. And it wasn't just the work, by the way. It was the mentoring he got from my in-laws. And that's what he spoke. In fact, he was a black gentleman who was talking about, like, he came in one day telling my mother-in-law, like, basically saying, like, I want to commit suicide because of, like, how people look at me for my skin color. And she basically said, like, that's a bunch of shit. Like, that, like, absolutely, you can make something in your life. You don't need to worry about those losers. And it transformed his life by his own admission. And imagine if, he couldn't get that job because guess what? We're going to have a $8 minimum wage in 1992 or whatever it was. That would have been a human tragedy. And that's what concerns me.
This is maybe an observation I've made, or you could say that Rand's made as well. Maybe you could flesh it out better. But this connection between, or rather, it's the non-selfish people, or the people who view selfishness as a bad thing, that seem to be almost tormented by, I guess, the views of or pleasing others. I don't know if I'm kind of putting it properly, but it seems the people who are more against the self-interested, when they say it's the selfish person who's conceited and only cares about themselves and kind of, is unafflicted by the opinion of the other. They just do what they want in the world. Everybody else be damned is what the selfish person does, they claim. It's them who seem like always kind of so strongly afflicted, or not them, but it's kind of those ideas that seem, when you hold them so seriously, they seem to inflict this kind of emotional damage and mental war. Have you ever noticed this, or is this a valid observation to make?
Well, one point Rand makes, which I think is really profound. So if you think about selfishness in her sense, now it's a provocative word, right? Like, everybody thinks they know what they mean by it, and they think it's self-evidently bad. But from her perspective, it's a person who wants the best for their own life, and who believes that everybody else should want the best for their own life, and that there's no conflict between you achieving the best in your life and me achieving the best. And what we think is that we should all independently pursue our well-being and then interact in these mutually beneficial ways. But if you think about the person who's preaching sacrifice, it's the idea that you have a duty to serve others. Well, yeah, on the one hand, they're going to be surrendering what they care about. But on the other hand, part of the perspective is they will have no qualms about demanding sacrifices from you and demanding that you serve them and treating you as obedient. And what does that look like? Well, it looks very similar to the conventional view of selfish.
Yeah.
And that's part of her view, is that the conventional view of selfish about sacrificing, that it means sacrificing others, that no, that is just the flip side of a view that says human service and sacrifice is moral. And she's rejecting all that and saying, no, don't serve me and I won't serve you. And that is the proper way for human beings to live, is independent. And independent, again, doesn't mean living on an island and not dealing with others. Like, you can be in a wonderful marriage and be independent. In fact, that's the only way to a wonderful marriage. Right. You can be in a great business and have wonderful colleagues, and you can be in a sports team and have awesome teammates, but you're all independent. You're all on a quest for your own joy in life and have a view of what's good and what you want to achieve and what you want to create. And the idea, and the basic idea of selfishness is, don't give up on that. Don't surrender it. Certainly not in order to conform to others, and certainly not in a quest to make others conform to what you want.
Like you said, I think the really profound kind of view there was like, it's not even that it's an either or. You said it's the only way to actually do it. It's the only way to successfully go about it, right? With an interest focused on your own needs for your own flourishing.
Well, Ayn Rand, one of the points she made, that's one of my favorite points ever, is that actually the best case for selfishness is reflecting on romantic love. And she said, like, how would you feel if your lover came to you and said, yeah, I don't want to sleep with you. I get no selfish joy from that, but you need me, and therefore I guess I'll, spread legs for you. Like, you would be horrified and disgusted. What you want from a lover is, you mean the world to me. You make my life indescribably better. Like, that it's that kind of like mutual selfish passion for another person that you're seeking from a romantic relationship. And it is, I think, in many ways, the best testament to the virtue of selfishness.
Absolutely. I think it's actually it's one of those examples and that you use with people. I've used it in discussions and debates, and it's people kind of really get it after that. Going back and forth on selfishness, altruism, all that stuff. Of course, you quickly realize that's a waste of time. But when you give them that kind of concrete case, it seems that everybody really starts to relate to that, and it hits home. So it's an amazing formulation. How long we got here? Going on an hour.
We're an hour 37.
So we can begin wrapping up with, I wanted to get Mr. Don, your views on we settled for whatever happens today. I don't know about this impeachment or whatever, but we've settled this kind of presidential cultural big shift thing that's been happening. And we're moving into what I guess you basically see a new kind of thing is building up. We're seeing some new trends build up. We're seeing people, maybe they're old trends, who knows, right? But people are starting to group up into their new groups and get their new ideas going. What have you observed? What do you think is coming? And what would you say is a good way to deal with it?
So I think I think that the kind of rise of tribalism, a fundamental factor is that we don't have a positive ideal, and that what happens then is basically a focus on negatives and a reaction to the other side. And so we get each side becoming more and more opposed to the other side. And then we've had what social scientists call increased sorting. So it's that the sides become kind of more unified, right? Like, now it's not just you have a certain political view and I have a certain political view. It's you have a certain political view, a favorite kind of music. You live in a certain kind of state, in a certain kind of, And so that all becomes more and more unified, and that makes things kind of more and more pressing. And but I think that if I want to give the hopeful spin on it, it's that people see that this is a real problem, and very few people like it, but very few people have a way out of it. Unfortunately, it's not something that you can just give I want to unite the country speech, because there's real divisions and disagreements. But the only way they're going to be resolved is through people putting forward positives. But now the nice thing about a situation where everybody hates the status quo is you're open to new ideas. Now there's a danger with that, is you can be open to really bad ideas. And we've seen historically, usually when things get kind of messy and the status quo falls apart, people turn to worse ideas. But there's nothing inherent in that. And I think one of the things that I'm hopeful for is that as people become unsatisfied with the status quo, they'll start to examine and kind of grope for better ideas. And that is, I think, the real opportunity. The opportunity is to focus on a positive. I am not about crushing the left or owning the right. I'm about a quest for happiness in a society that allows individuals to be on a quest for happiness. I'm not, anti-conspiracy theory. I'm pro-reason and pro-logic and pro the mind. And so that's the thing that to focus on is if you're concerned with the state of today, it's don't focus on, crushing all that is bad, though it's important to point out the bad and that it is bad, but you have to have something better to offer. This is the maiden thing I said, when the early Black Lives Matter protests came about, I said, I'm very sympathetic to this and really want something good to come out of it. But what I said, and I think this is like the day after the first one, day after the first George Floyd protest, what I said was, it really worries me that they don't have a positive, specific agenda that they're for. All we know is we're kind of saying we're against what happened to Floyd and we're against racism. But I said, if you don't have a positive agenda that's clearly defined, it can be taken over by any demagogue that knows what they want. And unfortunately, I think that very much happened, or at least it happened in significant part by the Black Lives Matter movement.
What do you think of the philosophic primaries of the movement, if you could?
I mean, insofar as they have very defined ones, I think it falls under the umbrella of critical race theory. Again, this is not every person who attended the protests, and it's not even any person who endorses the slogan.
Is even going on. Let's get
right.
That. Yeah.
But if you think about the people Black Lives Matter TM, it's basically this critical race theory. And the important element to get of it is, so I talked about the Enlightenment view that we have a universal interest as human beings in reason, and we can communicate and deal with one another by reason. This is the view that your lived experience puts you in a universe that I cannot understand. And my lived experience and my higher level of privilege, let's say, presumably, that puts me in a universe that can't understand you. And so we're locked in a power struggle where neither side can understand the other. And all that we can hope for is that the oppressed rise up to take down the oppressors. And it's that kind of power struggle view where human beings can't deal with one another by reason and can't understand one another by reason. That is, I think, at the heart of the viewpoint. And then if you think about what racism is in that view, it's not me ascribing things to you because of the color of your skin. It's any form of a group having more power or any value. So this is the whole idea of institutional racism. It's not about me discriminating against people or ascribing things to them. It's purely an issue of there's an unequal number of benefits, whether it's money or prestige or status or job. There's some inequality, and that therefore that must be embedded in the institutions, and that the institutions are therefore inherently discriminatory. So that's their whole outlook. Whereas my view is that what we should be concerned with is what are the basis on which we're judging people. And I think the way that you judge people properly is by their own choices and actions and character. And that something like a person is a racist to the extent they think skin color is relevant to that. And they're a non-racist to the extent that they don't think skin color is relevant to that.
I'm glad you came here. There's two concepts that I want you to kind of evaluate for us. kind of evaluate their validity. And it's one of the implicit bias. Have you heard of this term or concept? And we debate on it. It's central to the systemic racism topic in the discussion and in the debate. I want you to answer if it's valid or not. And then the second one was, as you mentioned, institutional or systemic racism, because you're on the Harry Binswanger letter as well as me. And Dr. Binswanger had a great take on systemic racism recently on the concept. And I just wanted to see kind of your views on evaluating these concepts, starting with the implicit bias one, which for some people listening is essentially kind of like this ability, your subconscious acts in a way to these social structures, maybe these innate ideas, these conceptions you have that aren't necessarily chosen or being acted on, are kind of a reaction to your association with Black people or disenfranchised people or all the different groups that can be discriminated against. And they say that you do this implicitly. So that's why the argument becomes, systemic racism is real or it's there, even though it's not explicit in the wording of the law, or that guy didn't say anything racist, but it was still a racist act. Central to that view is this concept of implicit bias. Does it have any validity, Mr. Don?
So, I mean, these are areas where I don't feel that I've fully worked out my views in detail, but I will say my current thinking on it. So my view is that both of those can be taken to point to phenomena that are real and important, but I'm skeptical of them as concepts. Mm-hmm. So it's a real phenomenon that you cannot be fully aware of certain ideas or premises that you have. And it's a really good thing that people can be made to become more and more aware. So I definitely think people can, if you want to put it, subconsciously hold prejudiced views of others.
I'll give you an example.
Sure.
Just really quick. So I made a YouTube video against the ideas of BLM, and someone had a comment there, are you not Black? Right? Instead of isolating the ideas, they isolated the skin tone. So that would be the premises that you were just mentioning.
Yeah, although that's more kind of explicit racism. It's you should have certain ideas because of your skin color. But I'm just thinking of more like clutch
your purse when you see a Black guy walking down the street kind of thing is the example they always give.
Always.
Yeah, and I do think that that's a real phenomenon. And now some particularly conservatives will defend it, statistically, and that's fine. But the point is not whether you should clutch your purse more. I mean, in general, I understand why women, one of the things I do is if I'm walking at, in the dark at night outside and there's a woman, I'll make an effort to kind of go out of my way to cross the street. Because if I was in her shoes, I'm some guy. And white or Black, that can be a scary thing. I think the basic point is that one shouldn't be beating oneself up about my quote implicit biases, but you want to become as aware as possible about your assumptions and think, are they good assumptions? And maybe sometimes you'll think, yeah, they're good assumptions. But if they're not, they're not. I certainly don't think that is the driving thing holding people back in life. And I don't think it's the most important crusade in the world, but it's a good thing to become more aware of that. And I mean, you would disagree personally
the leap to saying that because people could subconsciously hold ideas, though, almost they go, we don't have to provide explicit proof of the racism. Do you think that's an unwarranted leap that they do? Well, because people can subconsciously hold things, you can be racist without you knowing it. Therefore, systemic racism is real, and here's the evidence for it. Boom, disparities. That's kind of how they chain it all together.
Yeah, well, but that's the important part, is the whole chain. So the whole thing that they're trying to do is they're not arguing that you're for a view that says don't ascribe intellectual or moral characteristics to people based on skin color. What they're saying is view the whole world through skin color, but view it in our way of privilege versus the oppressed. That's what I think you have to object to. But it's a good thing to recognize that, I'll just, in my own experience, I know that I've probably like said things that were inadvertently offensive to somebody because I didn't even realize it would be a stereotype, right? Like, you know, I'll give you an example that's actually relatively recent. I just finished up work on a novel, and I submitted it. It deals a lot with race, and so even though I'm skeptical of the whole phenomenon, I submitted it to one of the what are they called? One of these sensitivity readers.
Oh wow, I didn't know.
She pointed out some cases where, now I think she pointed out many things that like everything ultimately could be a stereotype. If I describe the black woman as attractive, it's, oh, that's the hot, alluring black woman stereotype. If she was ugly, it's, oh, you're making, you know, all minorities out to be but there were some examples where I thought, oh my God, that was stereotypical and I wasn't aware of it. So I view that as a real thing. And I think it's good that we're having these kind of conversations to make people more aware of it. On the systemic racism thing too, I think it's there's a really bad framework that basically says if something produces inequalities, it's therefore discriminatory and wrong. No, some inequalities are either earned or they're accidental and meaningless, right? Like if more women than men decide to go in a certain field, it may be because there's discrimination. It may just be because they're different levels of interest. There's no rule. Thomas Sowell is great at this. There's nothing. Group differences are the to be expected and norm. There's no reason to think that they should be equal. But again,
it's the rule, not the exception.
Right. And but institutional racism has a real meaning in the sense that, like, I think there's a book, The Color of Law, which goes into we are not that far from when there were deliberate attempts in subtle ways to embed into law. I mean, I think if you want to talk about systemic racism, I think the drug laws were highly motivated by race, and that is an example of something that produces these kind of discriminatory outcomes. Now, the goal is not how do we create inequality? No, it's protect individual rights and stop putting people in jail for voluntary choices about using drugs. But so there is a real phenomenon there, but it's as with implicit bias, it's hard to conceptualize, and you want people to conceptualize it from an individualist perspective, not from one that basically is using race as a pretense for smashing the Enlightenment and the individual. You know, this kind of view that says if you use the word responsibility, that's a code word for racism. If you talk about individualism, that's a code word for racism. That kind of view I reject completely.
Now, the example you given, and I agree with everything you said. But the example you gave is actually it is a controversial topic on if the motivations of it were racism. But what I think that example, and a lot of them, especially one that Dr. Bainswanger brought out, shows that there actually is a valid concept of systemic racism, but you can't confuse that with, say, widespread individual racism,
right.
or sexism. Change out the words interchangeably, sexism or whatever. You cannot confuse what is done by, and it kind of goes all the way back up to the dollar and the gun type of deal. You can't confuse what is done by the force of government, the force of law, the force of explicit, through that whole political process, and then what is done by volitional actors, especially in the realm of things that can be done by volitional actors, even though, of course, on a moral framework, we say they shouldn't. There is also, a line where it's like that's outside of the realm of politics, which is how we organize society. So,
we're at 153.
Okay. So, but other than that, I think that was great. Any more final remarks on what people should be looking forward to, especially for us personally? Because I want to know what you have coming up next. Anything you could give us, any clues, good books to look out for, good content.
This year is going to be interesting. A lot of what I was doing last year was behind the scenes stuff. So I do a lot of stuff in my name. Like I said, I'll have a novel coming out this year. I'm launching a new project with my longtime co-author, Yaron Brook, that you should be hearing about in a few weeks. And But I've also, a lot of what I do is help other people become more effective as communicators of these kinds of ideas. And they should be coming out with projects between now and early 2022 that I think there'll be a lot of things that are really exciting. And so, I mean, the main way that people can keep up with all of this is I have a website, donswriting.com, and I have a weekly newsletter where I share these kinds of things. And then a lot of what I write about there is communication tips, because I think one of the challenges, going back to this point about me saying there's this exciting opportunity if we can provide people with a positive, I think that in general, pro-liberty and specifically pro-objectivist ideas, setting aside the exceptions, of which there are an important number, we've largely been, let's call it, underwhelming at that. And so my goal is to help make us more effective as champions for good ideas, so that they come across as overwhelmingly, obviously valuable and true. And that's a lot of what I write about, is how to be an effective communicator of ideas.
Reading a lot of writing of yours on the communication tips, and one of the books that our group was attracted to a lot was the Objective Communication books by Peikoff. We've tried to apply that a lot, seeing it as we are the generation of social media. If any objectivist thinkers besides yourself, obviously, are going to learn the new applications of this going into the future, it kind of rests on us, because we're the ones who grew up with it. I'm 27, but he's 16. You know, he has the world in his hand.
Yeah, quite literally.
Dude, you fooled me. Yeah, all right. Now you totally remind me. I mean, that was me at 16. That's awesome, man.
So it's insane how it's already, like, we've seen this positive effect, even especially since we started off as more of this libertarian kind of thing. It wasn't always fully explicitly that. And then we've become more philosophical, objectivist, moral principles, and we've taken ideas seriously, and we've dove in deeply. We've seen the change in the people we are in contact with. Now it's just not, oh, I'm going to pick up that economics book and stuff. Now they're talking about, let's read this philosophy, let's apply it to my life. Hey, I noticed this thing in TV, and it branches out to so many more places. So, like you said, I think the biggest key to that aspect of it is figuring out the communication principles that I thank you for your work on expanding on. And I think that's going to be a real big area in objectivist application. Objectivism applied to communication, applied to social media, YouTube, and overall art.
Yeah, no, I hope people find it helpful. It's certainly it is certainly one of my passions, to try to work out the principles of communication. Oh, Landon, you have chocolate all in your mouth, and you're gonna gross out everybody.
It's okay. Well, it seems like it's time. So other than that, any sign-offs for the people?
Yeah, I have one. So for anybody, because now you know I'm 16, but I want to be established. I know this is kind of like what you said when you were growing up. You know, you want to be established in the Ayn Rand Institute and stuff like that. But I kind of want to be established in kind of like the general area in which you work with Yaron Brook or OnCar. I'll not necessarily in the institute, but I want to be there. Mm-hmm. Right? How do you suspect for me to, or anybody else that is watching too, to try to strive for that?
Yeah, well, I mean, you should follow up with me after this, and we should just spend an hour talking about your personal situation. But hold on one second, Landon. I would say my general advice with career is always the Steve Martin principle, which is be so good they can't ignore you. And
I like that.
And I mean, part of what you're doing right now is preparing yourself for that, which is know as much as you can, try as much as you can, pay attention to the trends as much as you can, but then always be thinking about knowledge that is valuable to others. And this is going to help inculcate a happy or a healthy approach to philosophy generally. Whenever you're hearing ideas or like, oh, I'm getting really involved in this debate about, what if with private roads, somebody builds a road around somebody's house and then charges them $1 million to go to the grocery store. Step back and go, wait. Am I going to spend 2 hours working through this ridiculous scenario? or am I going to spend 2 hours thinking about an idea that's going to make a difference to me and to people that are out there in the world? And if you can help people with your ideas, then people will pay you for those ideas. So I'd say
Already seen. So
think about yourself not as generating ideas, even think about yourself as solving problems.
Yeah.
And if you are helping people solve their problems, then you will never want for a successful career. But we should definitely talk more.
absolutely.
2 quick things, and then we can end it off here. So one, I've chatted, or I've conversed with Craig Biddle about this specific thing. I have an article just waiting in my repertoire. I want to kind of publish it to TOS. That's trying to go on right now. And secondly, Ibis, you forgot information on James Valiant.
Dad.
Ibis.
Well, we'll talk about it after, actually.
Sure.
But other than that, this has been a surprisingly very good show. I hope you think so too, Mr. Watkins, and the invitation.
So fun, guys. This is an awesome conversation. I'm really happy you had me on.
Thank you, and thank you for everybody tuning in, and see you next time.
It's been Cudwy and Ibis on the Aporia. Any other information you want to find about Don Watkins, link in the description. You can purchase his books there. His website is there. So go ahead and check out the description. He's got everything.
So, in 3 months, 3 books. Amazing. So please pick them up.